Welcome to T.P. Hogan's Author Interviews. Today's guest is Australian historical romance author Elizabeth Allen Carter. Due to technical issues, there is no video with today's interview.
If you're asking for forgiveness, he said, there's no need. It was given weeks ago. But why won't you look at me? You've barely said 2 words to me since you got back from sea. Why is it you've always seem 1,000 miles away when we're in the same room? Elias lowered himself to her dressing table stool, letting out a long sigh. We've barely been in the same room since I returned. You live in your studio. You even sleep there. And I'm only a man, Laura. I can only undertake fruitless quests so many times before realizing I might at least salvage something by giving up. At least I can see what the rest of my life might go, and perhaps recoup some purpose and happiness from it. Tears pricked her eyes, and a lump formed in her throat. You hate me. Elias surged to his feet. She thought he might charge over and sweep her into his arms. The truth was, she hoped he would. He remained standing 8 feet away. Don't you understand? I could never hate you, never. You're leaving. How do you expect me to react? His words were delivered without inflection. He was withdrawing from her once again, and Laura feared this time it was for good. The thought broke her heart. I can't stay. If you were honest, you'd acknowledge the truth of it, she said. You love me, he challenged. Yes, she was sure she did, but if she told him again now, it would make leaving harder on the both of them. I wish I could be certain about life as you. I used to be, she said. I'm grateful to you in 100 different ways, Elias. You're everything a woman might dream of in a husband. Every woman but you. This time he didn't hide the accusation, and she felt committed to defend herself. This is not the life I expected. I was a naive debutante when we first met. All I ever dreamed about was finding a titled husband and exhibiting my paintings. I'm not like Sophia. I miss England. I miss society. I wasn't meant to be a sailor's wife. He turned his head away, hiding a pained expression. She licked her lips dry. This was harder than she thought it would be when she rehearsed this in her mind this afternoon. But it was not fair on such a kind and generous man to give him false hope, to let him go on believing there could be any future between them despite their feelings. Better he should find a woman who could love him wholeheartedly. I want to thank you for everything you've done for me and for Benjamin. Elias turned his body away now, exposing the broad expanse of back, his shoulders stretched taut. He did not answer. He remained unmoving. Laura swallowed down the lump in her throat and left the room. It was for the best, she told herself, all the way back to the studio. Better he should hate her. If she stayed, she would make him miserable, and in the end he would hate her anyway. Far better they part now. After a few months, he would see she was right, and he would find a woman worthy of him.
Guest today is Elizabeth Allen Carter. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hello, TP. Thank you very much for having me on your show.
Absolutely no worries. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I write historical romantic suspense, and my books tell the story of love's great adventure.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
I was born in Sydney, but I've lived most of my life on the Gold Coast, and I've written 7 novels, 2 novellas, and 3 short stories since 2013. And before the end of 2019, I'll have had another 6 novels and 2 short stories out.
Very, very prolific. I like the sound of that.
Oh, look, it stops the voices in my head if I just write them down. Really, really the way to do it.
Can you talk a little bit about your backgrounds and experiences and how that has had an impact on your writing or any of your stories?
Well, I've been a professional writer since the age of 19 when I accepted a cadetship with the Gold Coast Bulletin. And during that time, I've done all sorts of writing, news stories, feature stories, media releases, website copy, advertising copy, scripts for radio and television advertisements, and even co-wrote a script for a short film.
Wow, you've been busy.
I've always written. Ever since I was a child, I used to spend school holidays writing my own short stories if I ran out of things to read. I was really that kind of kid. So as a journalist, I spent a lot of time as a film and TV reviewer. So I got to appreciate how film and television was constructed, and as a result, I think that's really helped me with pacing and scene setting. And often I see fully formed scenes in my head, and often what I do is I just describe what I see, and that's actually how my first novel, Moonstone Obsession, came about. There was a scene that kept playing in my head over and over, and I thought, you know what? I am never going to get to sleep again unless I write this thing down. And before I knew it, I had 96,000 words and a manuscript that was pretty okay, and I could begin to knock into shape.
Moonstone Deception, that's an historical romance, yes?
It is. I write almost exclusively historical romance, although I had a little bit of fun with a couple of short stories for competition. So one was a contemporary, and that was set in an auction house. And I've even done a short story sci-fi, just 3,000 words, so keeping it very tight, and that was fun. And way, way back, getting close to 20 years ago, I will confess to have written an X-Files fanfic.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at
No,
all.
no, actually, that was a really useful standing point because, okay, you've got a universe and characterizations you can work with. That really, I think, started to whet the appetite to write something original in the end.
So, why are you so passionate about writing historical romance?
Well, history tells us so much about the world if only we'd stop and look at it. People have a funny relationship with history. They think that it's boring, that it's not relevant to today, and that couldn't be any further from the truth. If people think history is boring, well, then they're doing it wrong. It's endlessly fascinating. And if you take the position that people have always been the same, human nature is immutable, the only thing that changes is access to certain levels of technology, then it gives you a point of identification. Everything that leads up to this moment in time owes itself to history. We don't get here in isolation. So that's my passion for history, is to reveal parts of our past that people don't even know about.
Growing up, I have to admit that my entire experience with historical romance is basically the Victorian or the Edwardian era, and it was usually England and America. That was what I grew up reading, and so it was an absolute delight to pick up one of your books and find that it was set in Northumberland in 1077. And that's not the only place and time period that you've ever written in. I mean, there's Rome and Sicily and Turkey, and they're all before like 1820 even, and as far back as 235 AD, I think was the Rome
That's
one.
that's
Yeah,
right.
Dark Hearts, I think. So, what is your reasoning behind delving into these unusual eras?
There isn't an era in history that I don't love. I think as much as I love Victorian and Regency, I think it can be done to death unless you've got a new take on it. I've always asked why, and that always leads me down a rabbit hole into really interesting parts of history. So you mentioned Warriors Surrender and set in Northumberland in 1077. Well, 11 years earlier, 1066 was the Norman conquest
Mm-hmm.
of England. And I thought, well, it was really interesting because unlike a lot of invasions, the Normans and the Saxons actually had a lot in common. Even so, you had Saxon nobility, and all of a sudden, everything they had was taken from them. Sort of, how does a society recover from that? How does an individual begin to rebuild a future based on a past like that? So I really wanted to explore how people can rebuild their lives. With Dark Heart, that actually has a very modern connection. I was reading about political corruption in the UK and a particular politician by the name of Cyril Smith, who was a really, really disgusting figure. And I wondered, how on earth does someone like that, a major public figure, get away with the things he did? Of course, you couldn't explore a lot of that in a contemporary setting without the risk of being sued. So I thought, well, what's an interesting period in history which has a sophisticated society, government, and culture? And of course, Rome just was the perfect setting for that. Everybody knows, Caesar and Nero and all of the first emperors of the first 100 years of the empire, but nobody knows much about history about after Nero. So I was keen to explore a part of Roman history that we've long forgotten as well.
Wow, your mind goes to amazing places.
It is, and it's a case of, well, let's have an explore. Let's take a look how people were living. We also have in Captive of the Corsairs, issues of the slave trade in around the Mediterranean that a lot of people have forgotten about. So again, it's the opportunity to explore that part and bring it to an audience who may not have even considered that or had any knowledge of it.
What is your research like? Your books aren't just superficial gleanings over the history. Your characters are actually, covered in the grime and the dirt, and you have this very much an everyday feel. How do you get that in a time that is so long ago?
Thank goodness for the internet, I have to say. It makes research so easy. And a lot of universities put their research papers online, which makes it very easy to search. So my attitude to it is you've got to immerse yourself in the social and political world of the time. So where you can, reading original sources from the people who are actually there gives you an understanding of what it was like to go through that era in history. But also, historical romances or historical fiction are primarily the story of people first and foremost. So you've really got to imagine what their life was like. And if you go back and start with the premise that the only thing that's changed is the technology, people lived and laughed and loved 100, 200, 2,000 years ago, the same as they do today, makes it much easier to develop a really authentic world. But I try and immerse myself into it. There's a story that I'm about to start writing. It's set in Regency England, but I'm trying to immerse myself into industrial relations policy of the 19th century, social reform, and the law.
Nothing like a challenge.
It's a challenge, but it's great fun. I love it. My husband jokes that it's half an hour research to every 5 minutes writing, and he's probably about right.
You could probably by now, I think, be one of those people that do the recreations. They go out and live the weekend in the period. I think you'd be good at that.
Oh, as long as there's coffee. I can't do it without coffee.
I do have a confession to make is I did read a lot of historical romances when I was younger, and I got to the point where I hated reading them because it was the dreaded info dump. You get pulled out of the story while the author waxes lyrical about all the research they found. But of the books that I have read of yours, I haven't found that, which is refreshing and wonderful, and that's why I like your stories. What is your process for weaving research into it? Like, it's almost like the breath of your stories rather than just...
Look, I think as tempting as it is to throw in every interesting thing that you find, as I said before, the truth of the matter is the history must serve the story, because you're telling the story of two people who meet and fall in love and eventually live happily ever after. Look, save the info dump for the blog. But since you're walking in somebody else's shoes, things that you find interesting and remarkable as a 21st century person wouldn't have been interesting and remarkable to someone who was living in the 19th century or the 11th century or the 3rd century. You write it as matter of factly as you can. I like to include real historical events, as entertaining as they are. The ball gown and bling, the costume historical romances don't have the same level of appeal to me as ones that are tightly connected to their time and place. With everything, the history actually has to serve the story.
So what interesting experiences have you gone through while researching the books? What interesting things did you find? What surprised you? That kind of thing.
Lots of different things. I come away with really amazing. I would be a trivia queen on history. I'm pretty sure. But one of my favorites was something I came across with Dark Heart. I mean, of course, I appreciate Roman ingenuity, the aqueducts that we still see today, but I hadn't appreciated the level of industry, the way they turn that water, and Rome was built on flour and bread, and of course they used water mills to grind a phenomenal amount of grain. And when you think of mill houses, you think of those lovely little ones by the stream with a single water wheel. But no, the Romans had one that was big as 16 water wheels in one complex. They could produce, archaeologists have estimated, 4.5 tons of flour a day. And that equates to enough flour to bake 10,000 loaves of bread a day. There was one just outside of Rome on Janiculum Hill, and of course that's long gone. But there is a little place in France that where you can see where the water mill was, and you can get a feel for the scale. I was absolutely staggered by that, thinking if it hadn't been for the fall of Rome, how far technologically would we have come? Now that would be an interesting sci-fi sort of alternate universe topic.
Yeah. I'll let you do the research on that one. Has there been any reader questions or queries about your books that have surprised you or maybe influenced further books?
Well, with Moonstone Obsession, my first one, there was a villainess, a really nasty character by the name of Lady Abigail Huffle. And my husband and my goddaughter just absolutely loved her and said, she's got to have her own story. She's got to have her own story. So that's where Moonstone Conspiracy came from. And that left me with the challenge of how do I turn a Jezebel into a Rahab? And she was a great character to work with. She was very, very naughty with Abigail. So balancing that character between keeping what made her really interesting as a villain and using that to turn her into a heroine was fascinating journey there. And most recently, I was contacted by a descendant of Sir Charles Fremantle. And of course, Fremantle is a major city in Western Australia.
Mm-hmm.
He had come across some research that I'd done on Lord William Bentinck and mentioned that Fremantle's ship, the Milford, took Bentinck to Tunis when he negotiated the release of nearly 400 men who'd been forcibly abducted from Sicily. And that was really interesting, and that's become part of a plot point in the book that I've just finished called Shadow of the Corsairs.
Wow.
So that was rather neat. It also makes me sort of really humble in using real people, and you've really got to do a genuine service when you use real historical figures because their descendants are alive today. You've got to do history justice.
Well, I very much appreciate all the research that you put into your books. It's just amazing.
Thank you.
Where can readers find you and your books?
Well, my website is a great place to start. It's eecarter.com, or you can even type elizabethellencarter.com, or you can follow me on my Amazon page as well. A quick Google will find me.